Sarah Martinez walked her German Shepherd, Rex, through the quiet streets of Millbrook at exactly 6 in the morning. The small town was still wrapped in early dawn silence, with only the soft padding of Rex's paws and the gentle jingle of his collar breaking the peace. Sarah preferred these early walks. After 12 years as a Navy SEAL, she had grown to love the calm moments before the world woke up. She had moved to Millbrook 3 months ago, seeking the opposite of her military life. No more missions, no more life-or-death decisions, no more watching her back every second. Just a quiet house on Maple Street, her loyal companion Rex, and the simple pleasure of morning walks through tree-lined neighborhoods where the biggest worry was remembering to water the garden. Rex suddenly stopped, his ears alert. Sarah followed his gaze to see a police cruiser slowly turning the corner ahead. The car moved deliberately, almost prowling through the residential area. Sarah thought nothing of it at first. Police patrols were normal in any town, even peaceful ones like Millbrook. But something felt wrong. Rex sensed it too. His body tensed slightly, and Sarah noticed the way his attention stayed fixed on the approaching vehicle. Her instincts, sharpened by years of combat training, began to whisper warnings she couldn't quite ignore. The police car stopped directly in front of them. 2 officers stepped out. The driver was a large man with a thick neck and small, calculating eyes. His nameplate read Henderson. The passenger was younger, thinner, with nervous energy that made him fidget with his radio. His nameplate said Brooks. "Morning," Henderson called out, his voice carrying an edge that didn't match his casual greeting. "Good morning, officers," Sarah replied politely. Rex remained at her side, still and watchful. Henderson approached closer than necessary, invading her personal space in a way that felt intentional. "We've had reports of a suspicious person walking through this neighborhood. Early morning hours. Fits your description." Sarah kept her expression neutral, but her mind immediately began processing the situation. She knew every house on her walking route. She had introduced herself to most of her neighbors. No one had reason to report her as suspicious. More importantly, Henderson's body language and tone suggested this stop had nothing to do with legitimate police work. "I live here," Sarah said simply. "On Maple Street. House number 47. I walk Rex every morning at the same time." Brooks stepped forward, his hand resting on his baton. "We're going to need to see some identification." The request was legal, but the way they positioned themselves wasn't standard procedure. Henderson had moved to block her path forward while Brooks positioned himself to cut off her retreat. They were boxing her in, using techniques that had nothing to do with a routine identification check. Sarah reached slowly into her jacket pocket, making sure both officers could see her movements clearly. She pulled out her driver's license and handed it to Henderson. He glanced at it briefly, then looked back at her with a smirk. "Sarah Martinez. What do you do for work, Sarah?" "I'm retired." "Retired?" Brooks laughed. "You don't look old enough to be retired. What did you do before retirement?" Sarah had learned to be vague about her military service. Most people didn't need to know the details, and, in a small town, she preferred to blend in rather than stand out. "Government work." Henderson's eyes narrowed. "Government work? That's pretty vague. What kind of government work?" "The kind that's none of your business," Sarah replied quietly. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Henderson's fake friendliness disappeared, replaced by something much colder. Brooks moved his hand from his baton to his handcuffs. "We don't like smart-mouthed strangers in our town," Henderson said, "especially ones who can't give straight answers about their background." Rex growled low in his throat. The sound was barely audible, but Sarah felt it through his chest where his shoulder pressed against her leg. Her dog had excellent instincts about dangerous people. "Is there a problem here, officers?" Sarah asked. "I've shown you my identification. I've answered your questions. I live in this neighborhood, and I'm taking my dog for a walk." "The problem," Henderson said, stepping even closer, "is that you're being uncooperative. That makes us suspicious. And when we're suspicious, we have the right to conduct a more thorough investigation." Brooks pulled out his handcuffs. "Turn around, and put your hands behind your back." Sarah didn't move. "On what grounds?" "Resisting arrest," Henderson said with satisfaction. "I haven't resisted anything. I've been completely cooperative. Your attitude says different. Turn around." Now, this was the moment Sarah had to make a choice. She could submit to an illegal arrest, let them take her to the station, and sorted out later through proper channels. It would be the easiest path, the one that avoided immediate confrontation. But she recognized what was happening. These weren't good cops having a bad day or making an honest mistake. This was something else entirely. The way they had approached her, positioned themselves, and escalated the situation followed a pattern she had seen before in places where corruption ran deep and badges were used as licenses for abuse. "Officers," she said calmly, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to de-escalate this situation. I've committed no crime. I've been cooperative and respectful. If you arrest me without probable cause, there will be consequences you're not prepared for." Henderson laughed. "Consequences? Lady, we are the consequences in this town. Nobody's going to help you. Nobody's going to believe you. And nobody's going to care what happens to some stranger who doesn't know her place." Brooks moved behind her. "Last chance. Hands behind your back." Rex's growl deepened. Sarah could feel the tension in his powerful body as he read the threat in these men's postures and voices. Her dog weighed 90 pounds and had been trained not just as a companion but as a working animal. If she gave him the right command, he could disable both officers before they knew what hit them. But that would only make things worse. Sarah knew how small towns worked. These officers clearly had friends, connections, power. If she fought back now, she would become the aggressor in their narrative. They would paint her as a dangerous outsider who attacked local police. Instead, she made a different choice. "Rex, stay," she commanded quietly. Then, she turned around and placed her hands behind her back. Brooks roughly grabbed her wrists and cuffed her, tightening the metal restraints more than necessary. The cuffs bit into her skin, another small cruelty designed to show her who was in control. "What about the dog?" Brooks asked. Henderson grinned. "We'll call animal control. Dog that size could be dangerous. Might need to be put down for public safety." That was a mistake. Threatening Rex crossed a line that Sarah wouldn't tolerate. But she filed the threat away rather than reacting immediately. These men had just revealed something important about themselves. They weren't just corrupt. They were cruel. And cruel people always overreached eventually. They loaded her into the back of the police cruiser. Rex tried to follow, but Sarah commanded him to stay put. Her dog sat on the sidewalk, watching the police car with alert eyes, his body rigid with tension. "Good boy," she whispered through the window. "Wait for me." As they drove toward the station, Henderson turned in his seat to look at her. "You picked the wrong town to cause trouble in, lady. Chief Morrison runs a tight ship here. He doesn't like outsiders, especially ones with attitudes." "I wasn't causing trouble," Sarah replied. "I was walking my dog." "That's not how we're going to report it," Brooks said from behind the wheel. "Suspicious behavior. Failure to cooperate. Resisting arrest. Could be disturbing the peace, too. Maybe public intoxication if we're creative." Sarah listened to them discuss fabricating charges with the detached calm she had learned in combat zones. These men thought they held all the cards. They believed their badges, and their local connections made them untouchable. They had probably used this same playbook on other people, other outsiders who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. But they had chosen the wrong target this time. The Millbrook police station was a small brick building that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and hadn't been updated since. They brought her through a side entrance, avoiding the public lobby. Inside, the station smelled like old coffee and industrial disinfectant. The booking area was cramped, with a single desk and a holding cell that looked like it rarely saw use. Chief Morrison was waiting for them. He was a man in his late 50s with gray hair, a substantial belly, and the soft look of someone who had spent more years behind a desk than on patrol. But his eyes were sharp and calculating as they studied Sarah. "This is the troublemaker?" he asked. "Found her acting suspicious in the residential area," Henderson reported. "Gave us attitude when we tried to question her. Resisted when we tried to arrest her." Morrison nodded as if this confirmed something he already believed. "What's your name?" "Sarah Martinez. And I'd like to know what crime I'm being charged with." "You'll know when we decide," Morrison said. "Empty your pockets." The booking process was deliberately humiliating. They took her belongings, made her remove her jacket and shoes, and searched through everything twice. They photographed her, fingerprinted her, and put her in the single holding cell despite having no legal basis for any of it. The cell was small and bare, with a metal bench and a toilet that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks. Sarah sat on the bench and began to plan. These men had made several critical mistakes already. They had arrested her without probable cause. They had threatened her dog. They had discussed fabricating charges in front of her. And they clearly believed she was just another powerless victim they could abuse without consequences. They were wrong on every count. Sarah had spent 12 years serving her country in the most elite military unit in the world. She had survived Taliban ambushes in Afghanistan, terrorist attacks in Iraq, and covert operations in places that didn't officially exist. She had been trained by the best, tested in the worst conditions imaginable, and had never failed a mission. More importantly, she wasn't alone. Even in retirement, Sarah maintained connections with people who had the power and authority to bring down corrupt small-town police departments. She knew federal agents, military investigators, and Department of Justice attorneys who specialized in civil rights violations. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. How deep did the corruption go? Was this just two bad cops, or was the entire department involved? Did it extend to the mayor's office, the court system, other local officials? She didn't have to wait long to start getting answers. Around noon, Brooks brought her a sandwich and a cup of water. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with his keys, and avoiding eye contact. "Look," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't overheard. "This doesn't have to be a big deal. Chief says if you apologize and pay a fine, we can let this go. Disorderly conduct. Minor charge. You pay $200 and promise to stay out of trouble." Sarah studied his face. Brooks was younger than Henderson, probably in his first few years on the force. He was uncomfortable with what they were doing, but not enough to stop it. Classic case of a decent person who had gotten in too deep with corrupt colleagues and now felt trapped. "What if I refuse?" she asked. Brooks shifted uncomfortably. "Chief says we've got enough to make serious charges stick. Could be looking at jail time. Assault on an officer if we say you got physical. Your word against ours, and nobody knows you around here. And if I pay the fine, goes away. You leave town, we forget this happened." There it was. The shakedown. This wasn't about law enforcement or public safety. It was about money and control. They targeted outsiders, people passing through or new to town, knowing these victims would be isolated and vulnerable. Pay the fine, leave town, keep quiet, and nobody gets hurt. It was probably a lucrative scheme. How many travelers, tourists, or new residents had they extorted over the years? How much money had they stolen using their badges as weapons? "I need to think about it," Sarah said. Brooks nodded and left her alone. That afternoon, Henderson came by with a different message. Where Brooks had been uncomfortable, Henderson was confident and threatening. "Heard you're considering being smart about this," he said. "Good choice. But just so you understand the situation completely, animal control picked up your dog. Big German Shepherd. Could be dangerous. If you don't resolve this situation by tomorrow morning, that dog becomes a public safety issue. Might have to be destroyed." Sarah kept her expression blank, but inside, her anger crystallized into something cold and focused. They weren't just corrupt. They were evil. Threatening an innocent animal to extort money crossed every line that mattered. "Where is my dog?" she asked quietly. "Safe for now. But animal control facilities aren't great places for dogs to spend too much time. Stressful environment. Sometimes animals don't handle the stress well." The threat was clear. Pay or her dog would suffer. It was a tactic designed to force quick compliance, to make her so desperate to protect Rex that she would agree to anything. But Henderson had just made his second critical mistake. The first was underestimating who Sarah was. The second was threatening the one thing in the world she would kill to protect. That evening, Chief Morrison came to see her personally. He brought a chair and sat outside the cell like they were having a friendly conversation. "Ms. Martinez," he said, "I understand you're new to our community. Sometimes newcomers don't understand how things work in small towns. We have our ways of doing things, traditions that keep everyone safe and happy." "What traditions are those?" Sarah asked. "Cooperation, respect for authority, understanding that outsiders need to prove they belong here before they're fully accepted." Morrison leaned forward. "We've had problems with drifters, troublemakers, people who come here thinking they can do whatever they want. We've learned to be careful. I'm not a drifter. I live here. For 3 months. That doesn't make you a local yet. But it could, if you handle this situation correctly. Morrison was smoother than his subordinates, more politically savvy. He understood how to make corruption sound reasonable, how to frame extortion as community standards. Here's what's going to happen, he continued. You're going to pay a fine for disturbing the peace. $500. You're going to apologize to Officers Henderson and Brooks for your disrespectful behavior. And you're going to understand that in the future, when police officers ask you questions, you answer them politely and completely. And if I refuse? Morrison's friendly demeanor slipped slightly. Then, we charge you with resisting arrest, assault on an officer, and whatever else we think might stick. Your dog gets put down as a dangerous animal. And you discover that life in a small town can be very difficult for people who don't fit in. What does that mean? Building permits get delayed. Business licenses get denied. Neighbors stop being friendly. Services become unreliable. Insurance companies hear rumors about problem properties. Banks get nervous about mortgage applications. Morrison smiled coldly. Amazing how many little things can go wrong when the community decides someone doesn't belong. It was a comprehensive threat. Pay the extortion money and submit to their authority, or face systematic harassment designed to force her out of town. Morrison wasn't just running a corrupt police department. He was running a protection racket that extended throughout the local power structure. I see, Sarah said neutrally. I hope you do. This is your one chance to handle this quietly, and the next morning arrived with gray clouds and drizzling rain that matched Sarah's mood perfectly. She had spent most of the night awake, not from anxiety, but from careful planning. By dawn, she knew exactly what she needed to do. Chief Morrison arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed he held all the cards. Henderson and Brooks flanked him, both trying to look intimidating, but mostly succeeding in looking like overgrown bullies. Well, Ms. Martinez, Morrison said, settling into his chair outside the cell. Have you made your decision? Sarah stood up slowly, brushing wrinkles from her clothes. She had deliberately kept her expression neutral, giving them no hint of what was coming. I have, she said quietly. Smart choice. Henderson, get the paperwork ready. Brooks, call animal control and tell them to prepare the dog for release. Sarah waited until they were all looking at her expectantly before she spoke again. My decision is no. The silence stretched for several seconds as the three men processed what she had said. No, Morrison repeated, as if he hadn't heard correctly. No, I won't pay your extortion money. No, I won't apologize for crimes I didn't commit. And no, I won't be intimidated by corrupt police officers who think their badges give them the right to abuse innocent people. Henderson stepped forward, his face flushing red. You stupid. Careful, Sarah interrupted, her voice still calm but carrying a new edge that made Henderson stop mid-sentence. You're about to make this much worse for yourself. Morrison held up a hand to silence Henderson, but his own friendly mask had slipped away completely. Ms. Martinez, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. Actually, I understand it perfectly. You run a criminal enterprise disguised as law enforcement. You target vulnerable people, fabricate charges, and extort money through threats and intimidation. You've probably been doing it for years, getting bolder each time you get away with it. Brooks looked nervous. Chief, maybe we should... Shut up, Morrison snapped. Then, he turned back to Sarah. You're making a serious mistake. We try to be reasonable. Reasonable. Sarah's voice carried the first hint of real anger. You arrested me without cause, threatened my dog, and tried to extort money from me. That's not reasonable. That's felony corruption under color of authority. Henderson laughed harshly. Big words from someone locked in a cage. Who's going to believe you? Who's going to care? You're nobody in this town. Sarah smiled for the first time since her arrest. It wasn't a friendly expression. That's where you're wrong. I'm not nobody. I'm Sarah Martinez, Petty Officer First Class, United States Navy SEALs, retired. Service number 1247-889-67. 12 years active duty, multiple combat deployments, decorated veteran with a spotless record. The three men exchanged glances, but Morrison tried to maintain his confidence. So, military background doesn't make you special. Lots of veterans end up as troublemakers. You're right. Military background alone wouldn't make me special, but my current connections do. Sarah's voice became conversational, almost casual. See, when you spend 12 years in special operations, you make friends in interesting places. Federal agents who investigate civil rights violations. Military CID investigators who hate seeing veterans abused. Department of Justice attorneys who specialize in police corruption cases. Brooks was starting to look genuinely worried now. "Chief, maybe we should." I said, "Shut up." Morrison barked. But sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. Sarah continued as if she hadn't been interrupted. "About 6 hours ago, I should have checked in with my morning contact. When I don't check in on schedule, certain protocols get activated. By now, my absence has been noted by people who have the authority and resources to track me down." That was a lie, but a believable one. Sarah did maintain contact with several former colleagues, but she didn't have daily check-in requirements. However, these men didn't know that, and the fear in their eyes showed they were beginning to understand they might have made a catastrophic error. "You're bluffing," Henderson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Tell me, Chief Morrison, how much do you know about federal civil rights investigations? Have you ever seen what happens when the FBI starts looking into local police departments? They don't just investigate the specific incident that triggered their attention. They dig into everything. Every arrest, every use of force, every complaint, every financial record. They interview current and former officers. They offer immunity deals to people willing to testify about corruption." Morrison's face had gone pale. "You can't prove anything." "I don't have to. That's the beautiful thing about federal investigations. They do their own proof gathering, and they're very thorough. How many people have you extorted over the years? How many visitors, newcomers, people passing through town? Think any of them might be willing to testify if federal agents track them down and offer them a chance to get justice?" Brooks stepped closer to Morrison. "Chief, I think we should let her go. This is getting out of hand." "Nobody's going anywhere until I say so," Morrison snapped, but his authority was cracking. "She's lying, trying to scare us." Sarah pulled her ace card. 3 days ago, I had lunch with Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, FBI Civil Rights Division. We served together in Afghanistan. She's now based in the regional field office about 2 hours from here. Wanna bet she's not looking for me right now?" That was also a lie. Sarah hadn't seen Jennifer Walsh in over a year. But she knew Walsh existed, knew her background, and knew enough details to make the threat credible. More importantly, she could see that Morrison and his officers believed it. The police radio crackled to life in the next room. A dispatcher's voice cut through the tension. "Chief Morrison to the front desk. You have visitors." All 4 of them froze. Sarah maintained her calm expression, but inside she was surprised. She hadn't expected anyone to actually come looking for her this quickly. Morrison stood up slowly. "Henderson, watch her." "Brooks, come with me." They left Henderson alone with Sarah, which was another mistake. Henderson was the most volatile of the 3, the most likely to do something stupid when he was scared and angry. "You think you're so smart," he muttered, pacing back and forth in front of her cell. "But you don't know this town. You don't know what we can do to people who cross us." "What can you do?" Sarah asked. "Besides extort money and threaten innocent animals?" Henderson's face reddened further. "We can make you disappear. Accidents happen. People get lost in the woods around here. Bodies don't always get found." There it was. Henderson had just confessed to murder, or at least conspiracy to commit murder. Sarah filed that away as another piece of evidence she would need later. "How many people have you made disappear, Henderson?" Enough to know how to do it right. Before Sarah could respond, they heard shouting from the front of the station. Multiple voices, angry and demanding. Henderson looked toward the door nervously. Chief Morrison's voice carried down the hallway. "I don't care who you think you are. This is my station and my jurisdiction." A new voice answered, female and commanding. "And this is a federal investigation. Stand aside." Henderson's eyes widened. He looked at Sarah with something approaching panic. How did they?" "I told you," Sarah said calmly. "I have friends in interesting places." The shouting continued for several minutes. Sarah heard Morrison trying to assert his authority, the female voice cutting through his bluster with legal citations and federal mandates. Other voices joined the argument, more officials arriving as the situation escalated. Finally, footsteps approached the cell area. Chief Morrison appeared first, his face flushed and his uniform disheveled. Behind him came three people in dark suits. The woman in front was tall, professional, and carried herself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ms. Martinez," the woman said, "I'm Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, FBI. We need to talk." Sarah stared at her in shock. It really was Jennifer Walsh, her former teammate from Afghanistan, the military police officer who had transitioned to federal law enforcement after leaving the army. "What were the odds?" "Jennifer," Sarah said, "what are you doing here?" "Looking for you," Walsh replied. "When you didn't answer your phone yesterday, some people got worried. It took us a while to track you down." Morrison stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Agent Walsh, this woman was arrested for legitimate reasons." She was illegally detained," Walsh interrupted. "And we have evidence that suggests this isn't the first time your department has violated citizens' civil rights." Henderson, who had been standing behind Morrison, suddenly bolted for the back door. One of the other federal agents, a large man with the build of a former football player, caught him before he made it 5 steps. "Going somewhere, Officer Henderson?" the agent asked pleasantly. Brooks appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 more federal agents. His hands were already cuffed behind his back, and his face was the color of old paper. "Chief," Brooks said desperately, "they know about the money. They found the accounts. They know everything." Morrison's shoulders sagged as the full scope of his situation became clear. "How?" he asked weakly. Agent Walsh smiled grimly. "Anonymous tip came in 3 months ago. Someone reported systematic corruption in the Millbrook Police Department. We've been investigating ever since, setting up surveillance, tracking financial records, interviewing potential victims. We were getting close to making arrests anyway. Ms. Martinez's detention just gave us probable cause to move faster." Sarah was released from the cell, and her belongings were returned. As she signed the paperwork, she learned more about the investigation. The FBI had indeed been watching the department for months. They had identified at least 15 victims of the extortion scheme, tracked the money to offshore accounts, and documented a pattern of civil rights violations going back several years. "What about Rex?" Sarah asked as they prepared to leave the station. "Your dog is fine," Walsh assured her. "We picked him up from animal control this morning. He's waiting in my car." Outside, Sarah was reunited with Rex, who greeted her with enthusiastic tail wagging and concerned sniffing. He had been frightened by his night away from home, but he was unharmed. As federal agents led Morrison, Henderson, and Brooks away in handcuffs, Walsh explained what would happen next. There'll be a federal grand jury investigation. Civil rights violations, conspiracy, extortion under color of authority. These charges carry serious prison time. We'll need you to testify, of course. "Of course," Sarah agreed. "What about the other victims?" "We're tracking them down. Some have already agreed to testify. Others are still deciding whether they trust the system enough to come forward. Your case might convince them that justice is possible." Sarah watched the police cars drive away, taking the corrupt officers to federal holding. "How long have they been doing this?" "Best estimate? At least 5 years, probably longer. They were careful at first, only targeting people they thought were powerless. Drifters, tourists, people with criminal records who wouldn't be believed. But they got greedy and careless over time." "How much money are we talking about?" "So far, we've traced over $200,000. Could be more once we finish going through all the records." Sarah shook her head in disgust. $200,000 stolen from innocent people. How many lives did they ruin with false arrests and threats? That's what the investigation will determine. But, thanks to you, it's over now. As they drove back to Sarah's house, Walsh explained how the morning's events had unfolded. "We were already planning to make arrests this week," she said. "Your detention just accelerated our timeline. When we couldn't reach you yesterday evening, and when your neighbor reported seeing you arrested, we knew we had to move immediately. My neighbor reported it. Mrs. Chin across the street. She saw the whole thing, wrote down the officers' names and badge numbers, and called the state police when she couldn't get answers from the local department. The state police contacted us because they knew about the investigation." Sarah smiled. Mrs. Chun was a retired schoolteacher who had brought her cookies when she moved in. Apparently, she was also a woman who paid attention and took action when she saw injustice. She's the one who's been taking care of Rex, too, Walsh continued. Fed him, let him sleep in her garage last night, when animal control wouldn't tell us where he was being held. Back home, Sarah sat on her front porch with Rex at her side, processing everything that had happened. In less than 24 hours, she had gone from being a quiet newcomer trying to blend into small-town life to being the key witness in a major federal corruption case. Mrs. Chun came over with more cookies and 1,000 questions about the morning's drama. Other neighbors stopped by throughout the day, some to express support, others simply curious about the excitement that had disrupted their peaceful street. By evening, the story had spread throughout the town. The arrest of the police chief and 2 officers was the biggest news Millbrook had seen in years. Local reporters called, asking for interviews. Sarah politely declined, referring them to the FBI's Public Information Office. But, as night fell, and the initial excitement died down, Sarah found herself thinking about the bigger picture. Morrison and his officers would face justice, but the corruption they represented was probably not unique to Millbrook. How many other small towns had similar problems? How many other travelers and newcomers had been victimized by people who were supposed to protect them? More immediately, what would happen to Millbrook now? The police department would need to be rebuilt from scratch. The town would need to examine how corruption had been allowed to flourish unchecked. Citizens would need to rebuild trust in local institutions. Sarah realized she couldn't go back to being an anonymous resident trying to avoid attention. Like it or not, she was now part of this community's story. She had a role to play in helping the town heal and move forward. That evening, Mayor Patricia Williams came to see her. Williams was a soft-spoken woman in her 60s who had served as mayor for 3 terms. She looked exhausted and deeply shaken by the day's revelations. "Ms. Martinez," she said, settling into a chair on Sarah's porch, "I need to apologize on behalf of the entire town. What happened to you was inexcusable." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "But I wasn't the only victim. There were others, and they deserve apologies too." "You're right. And they'll get them. We're already working with the FBI to identify everyone who was victimized. The town will make financial restitution where possible." "What about the police department?" Mayor Williams sighed heavily. "We'll need to rebuild it completely. Bring in outside oversight, new officers, new procedures. It's going to take time and money we don't really have. But you'll do it." "We have to. The alternative is letting our town be remembered as the place where corruption flourished while good people looked the other way." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Rex chase fireflies in the gathering darkness. Finally, Mayor Williams asked the question Sarah had been expecting. "Will you stay? I know this has been a terrible introduction to our community, but most of us aren't like Morrison and his officers. Most of us are decent people who want to do right." Sarah considered the question carefully. Part of her wanted to pack up and leave, to find another quiet town where she could disappear into peaceful anonymity. But another part of her recognized that she had found something here worth fighting for. Not just her own peace of mind, but the idea that small communities could still be places where justice mattered and good people took care of each other. "I'll stay," she said finally. "But things need to change." "They will," Mayor Williams promised. Starting to 6 months after the arrests, Sarah stood at the podium in Millbrook's high school auditorium, looking out at a crowd of over 300 people. The town hall meeting had drawn residents from every corner of the community, all eager to hear about the progress being made in rebuilding their police department and local government. The transformation had been remarkable. Where once corruption had festered in shadows, transparency now guided every decision. The FBI investigation had concluded with federal convictions for all 3 officers. Chief Morrison received 12 years in federal prison. Henderson got 10 years. Brooks, who had cooperated with investigators and provided crucial testimony about the full scope of the corruption, received 5 years and would be eligible for parole in 3. But the real work had begun after the arrests. Sarah had accepted Mayor Williams' invitation to serve on the Police Reform Commission, a citizen oversight group tasked with rebuilding the department from the ground up. It hadn't been easy work. "When we started this process 6 months ago," Sarah told the assembled crowd, "we made a commitment to do more than just replace bad officers with good ones. We committed to building systems that would prevent corruption from taking root again. The new police chief, Maria Santos, sat in the front row. Santos was a 20-year veteran from the state police who had volunteered to take on the challenge of rebuilding Millbrook's department. She had insisted on complete transparency in hiring, training, and operations. Every officer wore body cameras. All traffic stops and arrests were recorded. Citizens could access police records through an online portal. Community oversight wasn't just welcomed, it was required. The new department has 5 officers, Sarah continued, all carefully vetted, all trained in de-escalation and community policing. Chief Santos has implemented policies that emphasize service over enforcement, protection over control. In the audience, Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. She had become something of a local hero after her quick thinking had helped expose the corruption. The city council had appointed her to chair the Community Safety Committee, where her sharp eyes and no-nonsense attitude kept everyone honest. But the police reform had been just the beginning. The FBI investigation had revealed that corruption extended beyond law enforcement. Building permits had been delayed or denied based on bribes. Business licenses had been subject to favoritism. Even parking tickets had been selectively enforced against people who crossed the wrong officials. Mayor Williams had responded by implementing what she called radical transparency. All government meetings were recorded and streamed online. Financial records were published monthly. Citizens could track every municipal expenditure above $50. It was more work for city employees, but it had begun to rebuild trust. We've also established the Victim Compensation Fund, Sarah announced. Thanks to recovered assets from the corruption investigation and contributions from local businesses, we've been able to provide restitution to over 20 verified victims of the extortion scheme. The fund had been Sarah's idea, but it had required months of legal work to implement. The federal government had seized the offshore accounts where Morrison and his officers had hidden their stolen money. Combined with donations from local businesses eager to distance themselves from the old regime, the fund had collected nearly $300,000. Some victims had been easy to find. Their names were in arrest records, their cases documented in court files. Others had been harder to track down. People who had paid the extortion money and left town, travelers who had been shaken down and wanted to forget the experience. But social media, newspaper coverage, and word of mouth had helped locate most of them. Each victim's story had been heartbreaking. A young couple whose honeymoon had been ruined by a false arrest and $500 fine. An elderly man visiting his grandchildren who had been detained for suspicious behavior until he paid $200. A single mother who had been threatened with losing her children unless she paid a court fee that didn't exist. The worst case had been a homeless veteran who had been repeatedly arrested and extorted for over a year. By the time investigators found him, he had paid nearly $2,000 to Morrison's scheme, money he had desperately needed for food and shelter. He was now receiving counseling and housing assistance through veteran services programs Sarah had connected him with. But compensation is only part of healing, Sarah continued. The real work is building a community where this can never happen again. That work had taken many forms. The high school had added a civics curriculum that taught students about their constitutional rights and how to recognize abuse of authority. The public library had started hosting monthly forums where citizens could ask questions about local government and police procedures. Community groups had formed to monitor city council meetings and hold elected officials accountable. Perhaps most importantly, people had learned to pay attention and speak up. Mrs. Chun had become something of a mentor to other residents, teaching them how to document suspicious behavior, whom to contact with concerns, and how to make their voices heard. The culture of passive acceptance that had allowed corruption to flourish was being replaced by engaged citizenship. After the town hall meeting, Sarah walked home with Rex, taking their usual route through the quiet residential streets. But now the early morning walks were different. Neighbors waved and called greetings. Children stopped to pet Rex and ask about his adventures. The community that had once felt foreign and unwelcoming had become genuinely warm. Chief Santos caught up with them 2 blocks from home. She often walked patrol in the evenings, making herself visible and accessible to residents. "Good meeting tonight," Santos said, falling into step beside them. I think people are finally starting to believe the changes are real. They are real, Sarah replied. But they're also fragile. It would be easy to slip back into old patterns if people stop paying attention. That's why we need you to stay involved. The commission, the oversight committee, the victim advocacy work. You've become the face of reform in this town. Sarah had mixed feelings about her newfound prominence. She had come to Millbrook seeking anonymity and peace, not public responsibility and attention. But she had also learned something important about herself during these months of community involvement. Retirement from active military service didn't mean retirement from service altogether. I've been thinking about that, she said, about making the commitment more formal. Santos raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Mayor Williams asked me to consider running for city council next year. The reform work is good, but it's easier to create change from inside the system than from outside it. They had reached Sarah's house. Rex trotted up to the front door, eager for his evening meal. Santos paused on the sidewalk, studying Sarah's face in the porch light. You'd have my support, she said, and probably the support of most people in town. You've earned their trust. That evening, Sarah sat on her porch with her laptop, working on the proposal she had been developing for weeks. The Millbrook Community Justice Initiative was her vision for expanding the reforms beyond local government. It would create partnerships with neighboring towns facing similar challenges, develop training programs for citizen oversight, and establish a regional network for reporting and investigating corruption. Several other small towns had reached out after news of Millbrook's reform spread. They had similar problems with corrupt officials, abusive police officers, and systems that protected the powerful while victimizing the vulnerable. The FBI had opened investigations in 3 nearby communities based on tips generated by Millbrook's example. Sarah's proposal outlined how successful reforms could be replicated and adapted to different situations. It included funding sources, training materials, legal frameworks, and ongoing support systems. She had already secured tentative backing from several federal agencies and nonprofit organizations focused on government accountability. The work was complex and demanding, requiring skills she had developed during her military career but hadn't expected to use in civilian life. Strategic planning, resource management, coalition building, and operational coordination. In some ways, it felt like planning military missions, except the enemy was corruption rather than foreign adversaries, and the weapons were transparency and citizen engagement rather than firearms and explosives. Rex settled down beside her chair, his presence a constant reminder of how this journey had begun. A simple morning walk with her dog had led to arrest, investigation, and ultimately to a complete transformation of her retirement plans. Sometimes life took unexpected turns that revealed purposes you never knew you had. Her phone rang, interrupting her work. The caller ID showed Jennifer Walsh's number. How's the proposal coming? Walsh asked without preamble. Nearly finished. I should be able to submit it next week. Good, because I have news that might interest you. The Justice Department is creating a new position, Community Liaison for Small Town Reform. Based on the success of the Millbrook Initiative, they want someone to coordinate similar efforts nationally. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. Are you offering me a job, Jennifer? I'm offering you a chance to take what you've learned here and apply it everywhere it's needed. Travel to communities with corruption problems, help them implement reforms, train citizen oversight groups, work with federal agencies to provide support and resources. It would be part-time consulting, so you could keep your base here in Millbrook. The offer was tempting. Sarah had found real purpose in the reform work, and the idea of helping other communities appealed to her sense of service. But it would also mean giving up the quiet retirement she had originally sought. Can I think about it? Of course, but don't think too long. There are a lot of Millbrooks out there, and most of them don't have Navy SEALs to help expose the corruption. After ending the call, Sarah sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about choices and consequences. 6 months ago, she had been a private person seeking peace and anonymity. Tonight, she was considering a role that would make her a public figure in the fight against government corruption. But maybe that was exactly what she was meant to do. Her military training had prepared her for combat against foreign enemies. Her experience in Millbrook had shown her how to fight domestic ones. Corruption, abuse of power, and systematic injustice were enemies worth fighting, even if the battlefield was courtrooms and city council meetings rather than foreign battlegrounds. Rex stirred beside her chair, sensing her thoughtful mood. She scratched behind his ears, remembering how he had been the first to recognize the threat posed by Morrison and his officers. Good instincts and loyal companionship had gotten her through military service. The same qualities would serve her well in civilian battles for justice and accountability. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A young woman in her 20s knocked on Sarah's door, holding a manila folder and looking nervous. "Ms. Martinez? My name is Amy Rodriguez. I'm a journalist with the Regional News Network. I wondered if I could talk to you about something." Sarah invited her in, curious about what had brought a reporter to her door. Rodriguez explained that she had been investigating corruption in rural police departments across 3 states. The Millbrook case had become a model for her research, but she had discovered something troubling. "I think what happened here was part of something bigger," Rodriguez said, opening her folder to reveal a map marked with red pins. "Look at this pattern. Small towns with similar corruption schemes, always involving traffic stops and extortion of outsiders, always targeting people who were unlikely to have resources to fight back." Sarah studied the map. The red pins formed a rough network across rural areas, connected by major highways and tourist routes. "You think it was coordinated?" "I think someone was training corrupt officers, sharing techniques, maybe even laundering money. The schemes are too similar to be coincidental. Same targeting methods, same extortion amounts, same threats against families and property." If Rodriguez was right, Morrison and his officers hadn't been independent criminals. They had been part of a larger network of corruption that extended across state lines. The implications were staggering. How many victims had there been? How much money had been stolen? How many communities had been poisoned by systematic abuse? "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. "Access to the FBI case files, if possible. Interviews with the convicted officers. And maybe your help in investigating some of these other locations. Your background and credibility would open doors that stay closed to journalists." Sarah looked at the map again, counting the red pins. Dozens of communities, hundreds of potential victims, millions of dollars in stolen money. The Millbrook case had been just the beginning. She thought about Jennifer Walsh's job offer, about the Justice Department's interest in replicating Millbrook's reforms. Maybe the federal government already suspected what Rodriguez had discovered. Maybe they were looking for someone with the right combination of skills and credibility to investigate a corruption network that spanned multiple states. "Give me a week," Sarah told Rodriguez. "I need to make some calls and confirm a few things. But if you're right about this, it's bigger than either of us can handle alone." After Rodriguez left, Sarah called Jennifer Walsh and explained what the reporter had discovered. Walsh listened carefully, asking pointed questions about the evidence and Rodriguez's methodology. "We've been seeing similar patterns," Walsh confirmed. "The Millbrook arrests led to information about other departments, other schemes. We think it's a training network, possibly run by former law enforcement officers who've gone mercenary. They teach corrupt techniques to small-town departments in exchange for a percentage of the take. How extensive is it? We don't know yet. But if your journalist friend is right, it could involve hundreds of officers across dozens of departments. The largest police corruption network in U.S. history." Sarah felt the familiar sensation of a mission crystallizing. The objectives were clear: expose the network, arrest the criminals, compensate the victims, and reform the systems that had allowed corruption to flourish. The resources were available: federal law enforcement agencies, citizen oversight groups, reform advocates, and investigative journalists. The enemy was formidable, but not invincible. "Jennifer," she said, "I'll take that job. But I want to expand the scope. This isn't just about helping individual communities reform. It's about dismantling a criminal network." "That's exactly what we were hoping you'd say." That evening, Sarah sat on her porch with Rex, watching the sun set over the town that had become her home in ways she never expected. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, and new opportunities to serve justice. But tonight, she was content to enjoy the peace of a community that had found its way back to integrity and hope. Mrs. Chun waved from across the street, where she was watering her garden, and keeping her usual watchful eye on the neighborhood. Mayor Williams drove by and honked her horn in greeting. Chief Santos walked past on her evening patrol, nodding respectfully as she ensured the streets remained safe. It was a far cry from the morning 6 months ago when corrupt officers had targeted a quiet stranger walking her dog. That stranger was gone, replaced by a community leader, reform advocate, and soon-to-be federal consultant with a mission that extended far beyond Millbrook's borders. But some things remained constant. Rex still enjoyed his evening walks. The streets were still peaceful, and justice, though sometimes delayed, still prevailed when good people refused to look the other way. Sarah Martinez had found her calling at last, and it was exactly where she belonged. Moral, as the mayor left and Sarah prepared for bed, she reflected on how quickly her quiet retirement had become something much more complicated. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe she had been hiding from the world for long enough. Maybe it was time to use her skills and experience to make a positive difference in a place that needed help. Rex settled down beside her bed, his presence a comforting reminder that some things remained constant even when everything else changed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the federal investigation continued, and the town began the difficult process of rebuilding its institutions. But tonight, justice had been served, and that was enough. Walk away with just some bruised pride and a lighter wallet. Tomorrow morning, I need your answer. After that, the offer disappears and things get much more serious. Morrison left her alone with her thoughts. Sarah lay on the narrow bench as night fell outside the small window near the ceiling of her cell. She thought about Rex, probably scared and confused in some animal control facility. She thought about the other victims these men had targeted over the years. She thought about the systematic abuse of power that let corruption flourish in places where people believed no one was watching. But, mostly, she thought about how these men had made the mistake of their lives when they decided to target a quiet woman walking her dog through a peaceful neighborhood. Tomorrow, she would give them her answer. But not the one they were expecting.